Hello. Hello, hello. Welcome on in. Happy Saturday. I'm very glad to have all of you hanging out here. Thank you so much, Grumble, for saying hello. Hope you're well. Today, we are starting off the broadcast by talking about black box thinking, by Matthew Syed. Marginal Gains and the Secrets of High Performance. So this is the book. As you can tell, I like being organized. I have all these little different pings, flags to tell me where I want to go, what I want to talk about. One of these pages feels kind of hard for some reason. It's like I have a bookmark in here. Nope, I guess that's just the middle of the book. Okay. Hello, Slater. Welcome. So, I did have a notebook that wrote down everything that I wanted to talk about, but I believe I left that at work, and it's the weekend, and I'm not going to go to work to pick up a notebook. Obviously, I've read this book, so we can talk about it. It is something that I did link in my Discord and a few times on my stream to get people interested in getting the book, reading it, and then talking about it. But since this is the first time that I'm publicly doing like a book club on my stream, I understand that it might have not gotten a lot of traction yet, but we are going to continue to do this every month, every other month, and read a lot of important books that help you center your life. So let's read a little bit of the description of this book. What links Mercedes Formula One team with Google? What links David's Team Sky in the aviation industry? What is the connection between the inventor James Dyson and the footballer David Beckham? They are all black box thinkers. Whether you're developing a new product, honing a core skill, or just trying to get a critical decision right, black box thinkers aren't afraid to face up to mistakes. In fact, they see failures as the very best way to learn. Rather than denying their mistakes, blaming others, or attempting to spin their way out of trouble, these institutions and individuals interrogate errors as a part of their future strategy for success. How many of us, hand on heart, can say that we have such a healthy relationship with failure? I'm slowly building up to that process, but it's very difficult. Learning from failure has a status of a cliche, but this book reveals the astonishing story behind most powerful methods of learning known to mankind, and reveals the arsenal of techniques wielded by some of the world's most innovative organizations. Their lessons can be applied across every field, from sports to education, from business to health. Using gripping case studies, exclusive interviews, and really practical takeaways, Matthew Syed, the award-winning journalist and best-selling author of Bounce, explains how to turn failure into success and shows us we can all become better black box thinkers. The closed captioning that I use is webcaptioner.com. It just listens to my microphone and then transcribes it. It's not perfect, but I think it does a great job for a free product. Learning from mistakes and how to respond properly to failure is a valuable discipline in which stimulates growth and harvests success. It's why I used to use a fail counter on my cast as well too, to talk about failure and make it seem like it's not necessarily a horrific thing to deal with. And therefore, we're reading and discussing this book. So this book opens up with a very sad case study from March 2005. A mother of 2 young children and a wife to a man named Martin went to go to a operation to deal with her sinuses. She was only 37 years old. Unfortunately, she started losing oxygen, and a nurse darted out to fetch a kit to access her airway via her mouth. It was a last resort, but Elaine, the lady who was getting surgery, was suffering from life-threatening brain damage. And at 11 a.m. that morning, the phone rang in the living room of the home of the family. Martin was asked to return to the hospital, and they saw that his wife went into a coma. There was some problems during the anesthesia. It is one of those things. Accidents sometimes happens. We don't know why. The anesthesists did their very best, but it just didn't work out. It was a one-off. I'm so sorry. There was no mention at the fetal temps of incubation, no mention of the failure to perform an emergency tracheostomy, and no mention of the nurse's attempt to alert the doctors to the growing disaster. At 11:15 p.m. on April 11, 2005, Elaine died after 13 days of being in a coma. She was only 37. And our author started off with this case study to show the negative feedback loop that a lot of medical professionals put themselves into because they are afraid of failure, because they are afraid of malpractice suits, because they are afraid to admit that things do go wrong and they might not have the perfect expertise to deal with every single situation memorized by heart. They would rather fail and say that it was an accident or a one-off rather than learn from those mistakes, talk about it as a community, and grow. There are changes within the medical community that are starting to shift that ideology, but it is still something that I'm sure, unfortunately, either within our own loved ones or family members or friends have heard of cases like this, or maybe tangentially from someone in your neighborhood and you were reading your local paper that a medical operation has gone wrong. It is not just the number of deaths that should worry us. It's also the non-lethal harm caused by preventable error. A clinical professor at the School of Nursing in the University of Minnesota referred to a woman from her neighborhood who underwent a bilateral mastectomy for cancer. So that means getting rid of a woman's breasts. Only to find out shortly after the surgery that there was a mix-up in the biopsy reports and that she wasn't the one who had cancer. These kind of errors are not fatal, but they could be devastating to the victims and their family. We are not only dealing with 1,000 preventable deaths a day, but 1,000 preventable deaths and 10,000 preventable serious complications per day. It affects all of us. The problem is not a small group of crazy, homicidal, incompetent doctors going around causing havoc. Medical errors follow a normal bell-shaped distribution. They often most occur when the clinicians get bored, not when the clinicians get bored or lazy or are malicious, but when they're going about their business day to day with diligence and concern you would expect from the medical profession. So why do these mistakes happen? The World Health Organization lists 12,420 diseases and disorders, each of which requires different protocols to diagnose and to treat. This complexity provides ample scope for mistakes in everything from diagnosis to treatment. Another problem is scarce resources. Doctors and nurses are often overworked and hospitals overstretched, and they frequently need more money to do more tests, more treatments, and so on. And the third issue is doctors usually have to make very quick decisions. There are serious cases where there is sufficient time to consider all alternative treatments. And so finally, the culture. It turns out many of the errors committed in hospitals have trajectories, subtle but predictable patterns. Accident investigators call these signatures. With open reporting and honest evaluations, these errors could be spotted and reforms put in place from them happening again, as that happens in aviation. So if you think about a flight, you can look up that flight number and find out everything about that plane, how many flights it's recently took, what city did it come from, what city is it going to, and what is the rest of its trajectory for the rest of that day, that week. You can also find out who the pilots are, obviously the company who owns and operates those planes, and the subcategories of companies that might be contracted out to work on that flight for certain types of paths. So if they're doing a quick domestic regional from one side of a state to another, that might get contracted out to a smaller team for a few hours and then comes back to the other airport and then goes on a longer flight, depending on what the plane can do and so on. This is called black box thinking, being very transparent about every step of the way and being able to logically and step by step look at every decision that's made and tear it apart to find out why certain errors have happened or why certain successes happened, and learning from that and becoming better. Unfortunately, the medical industry, for instance, doesn't have that kind of transparency or clarity into their modes and operations. So when our professionalism is threatened, we are liable to put up defenses. We don't want to think of ourselves as incompetent or inept. We don't want our credibility to be undermined in the eyes of our colleagues. For senior doctors who have spent years in training and have reached the top of their profession, being open about mistakes is traumatic. Also, society as a whole has a deep contradictory attitude to failure. Even as we find excuses for our own failings, we are quick to blame others who mess up. In the aftermath of the South Korean ferry disaster of 2014, Korean Prime Minister accused the captain of unforgivable, murderous acts before any investigation had even taken place. This Prime Minister was responding to a frantic public demand for a culprit. Failure to learn from our mistakes is one of the single greatest obstacles to human progression. We are often so worried about failure that we create vague goals, so no one can point out their finger when we don't achieve them. We come up with face-saving excuses even before we attempt something. We all have the sophisticated ability to delete failures from our memory. A closed loop is when a failure does not lead to progression because information on errors and weaknesses is misinterpreted or ignored. And an open loop does lead to progress because the feedback is rationally acted upon. Success can only happen when we admit our mistakes, learn from them, and create a climate where it is, in a certain sense, safe to fail. And that's just the first chapter of this book. So it's very profound in being able to look into yourself and look into failure. There are times that I fail. There are times that I don't do the best that I could have done with all the information I had about the situation and all of my previous experience doing similar situations. And that's okay. There are strong hints sometimes that those who notice a closed loop will give to others in order to fix a mistake. And people like this antagonize about making their concerns more explicit and are intimidated by the sense of hierarchy and authority of those they are trying to interrupt. Social pressure and the inhibiting effects of authority destroy effective teamwork and learning from mistakes. Eleanor Roosevelt put it, learn from the mistakes of others. You can't live long enough to make them all by yourself. Attention is a very scarce resource. You might be able to fool yourself into thinking that you can multitask, and it is possible to a small extent, such as brushing your teeth is a very rote memory, something that we kind of have ingrained in us. It's a very simplistic physical act that we all do once or twice a day. And listening to a conversation that someone is speaking to you about, or reading an article while you are humming the birthday song or trying to get through the 30 seconds of brushing your teeth. So it's possible in small doses, but people overestimate their ability to pay attention and also overestimate greatly their ability to multitask. So that's something that people really do need to look at. Also, this is a well-studied aspect of psychology. Social hierarchies inhibit assertiveness in people. In many circumstances, task-focused behavior is an effective way of applying your own effort. The problem is when this focus comes at the expense of the bigger picture. That's why excessive focus undermines performance, and in the cases of aviation, particularly safety. One of the ways that closed loops perpetuate is when people don't interrogate errors or mistakes. Sometimes they don't even know that they have made one, even if they expect that they have. Hello, Sanguine. Hello, Sunny. Welcome on in. Thank you very much for coming by to our book club. Currently, I am going through everything that I've highlighted and flagged in this book, Black Box Thinking. It was our book of the fall, and it is talking about failures and why they are good, because you need to look at them and learn from them. In effect, practice is about harnessing the benefits of learning from failure while reducing the cost of failure. It is better to fail in practice in preparation for the big stage than on the big stage itself. So, for instance, practicing your speech in front of a trusted loved one so they can point out any speech fillers or logical errors in your speech that you might have not seen because you were so focused on your performance, so focused on, well, I need to get this intro, get these 3 argument points in, and then have a conclusion, that you might have missed a very important section that someone who's coming into this subject brand new, fresh-faced, will be able to see. You always have to take into account all data, including data you cannot immediately see if you're going to learn from adverse incidents. That's also a very difficult thing, because if you don't know what you're looking for, how are you supposed to examine it? The paradox of success is that it is built upon failure. So, for instance, the Wright brothers started off aviation. If we as a society did not learn from their mistakes, from the errors that they made when they first started making flying objects, we wouldn't have cargo planes and passenger planes that take us halfway across the world in 16 hours. In one day, less than that. We need to be able to effectively communicate these things to each other. We cannot have the moral failure of forgetting these failures and lessons and having to relearn them over and over again. Most closed loops exist because people deny failure or try to spin it. Closed loops are designed, wittingly or otherwise, to make failure impossible, and this is why they're mesmerizing. They're compatible with everything that happens, but that also means that you can't learn anything because you're not looking at it with a critical eye. For instance, science is not about confirmation, it's about falsification. Knowledge does not progress merely by gathering conformatory or observational data, but by looking for contradictory data points. Success is always the tip of an iceberg, and beneath the surface of success, outside of our view, outside of our awareness, outside of what others can perceive sometimes, is a mountain of necessary failure underneath the sea. I believe this is... There we go. We learn from our mistakes. It's as simple as that. Says Gary Kaplan, who worked at Virginia Mason and saved thousands of lives. So let me look up this case study. 2002, Dr. Gary Kaplan, recently appointed chief executive of the Virginia Mason Health System in Seattle, visited Japan with fellow executives. It was at the Toyota plant that he had a revelation. Toyota had an unusual production process. If anyone on the production line is having a problem or observes an error, they pull a cord that halts the production across the whole entire plant. Senior executives rush over to see what's wrong, and if an employee is having difficulty performing their part of the job, they help them. When the error is assessed, lessons learned, and the system is adapted. This is called the Toyota Product System, TPS, and it's one of the most successful techniques in industrial history. One of the key reforms that Kaplan brought back was to encourage his staff to make a report whenever they spotted an error that can harm patients. He instituted 24-hour hotlines as well as an online reporting system. He called them patient safety alerts. This new system represented a huge cultural shift for staff in the hospital. And because of the steep hierarchy, nurses and junior doctors were fearful of reporting senior colleagues. To Kaplan's surprise and disappointment, few conflicts and reports were made. Oh my God. In November 2004, everything changed at Virginia Mason. Mary McClinton, 69, mother of 4, died after she was inadvertently injected with a toxic antiseptic instead of a harmless marker dye during a brain aneurysm operation. The two substances were placed side by side in identical stainless steel containers, and the syringe had been drawn from the wrong one to start off with. During her stay at the hospital to save her life, one of her legs were amputated and she died through multiple organ failure 19 days later. Gary Kaplan did not respond by evading or spinning the truth, by publishing a full and frank apology, the opposite of what happened after the death of Elaine that we talked about the very first case study. We can't say how appalled we are at ourselves. You can't understand something that you hide. It was a tough time for the 5,500 staff at Virginia Mason, but the death was a rallying cry. It gave us the cultural push we needed to recognize how serious an issue not reporting errors is. Suddenly, patient safety alerts flew in. Those who reported mistakes were surprised to learn that they were praised, not punished, for making those reports. An oncologist made a report after a colleague said that he failed to spot a low magnesium level of a patient. I missed it. I don't know how I missed it, but I realized it's not about me, it's about the patient. The process needs to stop me from making a mistake. I was able to say, I might be the reason for this mistake. Fix me. So, if it's implemented properly, and failure isn't looked at like a serious character failure, like a fatal error in someone's personality, in someone's credibility, and looked at upon as instead, hey, a mistake happened, let's fix it before it gets even worse, and it's something that we all regret. That's very important. So, we have finished part 1, and now we get into some heavy psychological stuff such as cognitive dissonance. So basically, if you don't know what cognitive dissonance is, it is a psychological term, and it means that when you are given information that is contradictory to your beliefs of that object, of that ideology, of that situation, you reject the new information because it is too painful mentally to deal with the possibility of being wrong. So you might see this in politics, for instance. If you get information from a website about how an event went down and you make judgment calls about the people who were involved, and then a few days later a retraction or a news story comes to light that gives you more facts that make the situation more clear, there are a lot of people who will basically ignore that second and more robust report because they've already made their decision. And it takes a lot of energy and effort and thought process to make decisions and judgments, and they do not want to do it again, basically. Hello, Lord. Welcome on in. Systems that do not engage with failure struggle to learn. So, in the autumn of 1954, Fessinger, who was a researcher at the University of Minnesota, came upon an unusual headline in his local paper. Prophecy from Planet Clarendon, call to city, flee the flood. It was a story about a housewife called Keach, who claimed to be a psychic contact with a godlike figure from another planet, and told her that the world would end on the dawn of December 21st, 1954. Her real name was Dorothy Martin, by the way, but he changed her name to protect her identity, but eventually it came out. Fessinger wanted to see how the cultists would react after the prophecy had failed, because obviously the world was going to end on December 21st. Fessinger predicted that the cultist belief would be unaffected and they would become more committed to the cult than ever before. And he was right. This classic book is called When Prophecy Fails, and they simply redefine the failure. So, for instance, instead of saying, we have failed, the world isn't ending on December 21st, let us reevaluate what we think about this godlike figure in this cult and come up with a more logical conclusion of how the world is going to end and what we should do about it. These cultists basically said, well, we actually just got the date wrong. The world is still going to end. It's our mistake that we didn't really understand the god because we were just lowly plebs, and we're still very committed, is the gist of what happened there. They think that also, we save the world. Core members went out on a recruitment drive. Our little group sat all night long, spread so much light that our godlike figures saved the world from destruction. And they went and recruited more people to make sure that they can continue to save the world. When we are confronted with evidence that challenges our deeply held beliefs, we are more likely to reframe the evidence than we are to alter our beliefs. We invent new reasons, new justifications, new explanations, and we ignore the evidence altogether a lot of the time. Cognitive dissonance is the term that Fessinger coined in his book, Why Prophecies Fail. We have two choices when we hit cognitive dissonance. The first is to accept our original judgments were at fault. But the difficulty with this is that it's threatening to our intelligence. So the second option is denial. We reframe evidence, we filter it, spin it, ignore it. And we carry on under the comforting assumption that we were right all along. Just a few details might have been a little fuzzy. The more we have writing on our judgments, the more we are likely to manipulate any new evidence that calls them into question. Our justice system, our criminal court system also has this issue. A very important quote that talks about these wrongful convictions in this chapter. In the United States, there are grave consequences when an airplane falls from the sky. Serious inquiries are made. What went wrong? Was it a systemic breakdown, an individual's mistake? Was there official misconduct? Can anything be done to prevent this from happening again? But America keeps virtually no records when a conviction is vacated based on the evidence of innocence. Judges typically write one-lined orders, not official opinions, meaning that they don't analyze what went wrong, and neither does anyone else. And so it becomes a closed-loop cycle, and we continue to fail over and over again. So another psychological quirk that we have is self-justification. We lie to oneself to destroy the very possibility of learning. We can't learn from failure if we convince ourselves through endless subtle means of self-justification, narrative manipulation, and wider psychological arsenal of dissonance reduction that failure didn't actually occur. Most failure is given a makeover with justifications such as, it was a one-off, it was a unique case, we did everything that we could. But self-justification isn't necessarily always a bad thing. It helps us not agonize over painful mistakes. Staying awake late at night, wondering if we're going to get married, if we're going to get hired for that job, if going into that major was the right thing to do. But it's hardly likely that health professionals would engage in this kind of deceit on a large scale. The vast majority of doctors and nurses are committed and decent people, and are heroic and care for their patients. And that's the tragedy of cognitive dissonance. It allows good and motivated people to harm those they are working to protect, not just once, but again and again, and over, if they don't look at failure, and if they don't learn from their mistakes, if they are afraid of doing so. There is something also called the disposition effect, a well-studied phenomenon in behavior finance. We are more likely to keep the shares that have lost money within a stock or so, regardless of future prospects, because we hate to crystallize a loss. And selling a stock basically means I made an error buying this stock in the first place at this time, and therefore I am selling before I lose even more of my money, even more of my investment that I made a few months ago. And once we crystallize that loss, it hurts us mentally because it's like, oh, I made a mistake. Also, confirmation bias is another quirk that is very close to cognitive dissonance. Basically, you can look at something like a pattern, 2, 4, and 6. And most people would see that the underlying pattern in the sequence is, well, it goes up by 2, for instance. And that's a possibility. Most people just try to confirm their hypothesis. But instead, what you should do is try to falsify it. And that's what science does. You have a null hypothesis that you're trying to prove or disprove. Most people get stuck in a narrow and wrong hypothesis, and the only way out is to make a mistake that turns out not to be a mistake at all. Committing errors is not the fastest way to the correct answer. It's the only way. College students presented with this 2, 4, 6 experiment were allowed to test as many sets of 3 numbers as they wished. Fewer than 10% discovered the true pattern. So I remember reading this, but I don't remember what it said about what was the... yes. So 4, 6, and 11 fit the pattern. but 5, 2, and 1 did not fit. And so basically, there was a formula that was a part of this study, and they were just given some outputted numbers. So 2, 4, 6, 4, 6, 11 was another possibility as well too. And people had to basically prove their hypothesis of how this pattern was moving along. And most people came up with one pattern, and they did not try to falsify it or find more justification for why they chose that answer to the pattern. Karl Popper is a famous philosopher, and he wrote, "For if we are uncritical, we always shall find what we want. We shall look for and find confirmations, and we look around and away from and not see whatever might be dangerous to our pet theories. In this way, it's only too easy to obtain overwhelming evidence in favor of a theory which, approached critically, would be refuted." So that's just more clarity from a philosopher about that idea. Another issue of cognitive dissonance is something called the risk-benefit ratio. Risk-benefit ratio is not about weighing the life of a patient against the few moments that it takes to change gloves, that they might be allergic to latex, for instance. Rather, the risk-benefit ratio is about weighing the life of the patient against the prestige of the surgeon, whose entire self-esteem is constructed upon the cultural insinuation of his own infallibility of being a world-renowned surgeon. So there was, I forget exactly what this guy's title was in this case study. Peter Provost, a doctor, at Johns Hopkins University Hospital, was an anesthesiologist, and they were in a surgery, and there was a patient about 90 minutes into the operation that started wheezing, her face was reddening, and her blood pressure plummeted. Peter suspected that she had a latex allergy and wanted the surgical gloves to be changed. That surgeon basically said, "This is clearly not an allergic reaction, I'm not changing my gloves." So what Peter did was tell a nurse to page the dean of the hospital in order to override the surgeon. The surgeon budged finally when the phone was picked up. He swore, dropped his gloves, changed them. Once the operation was over, tests confirmed what Peter had suspected all along: the patient had a latex allergy. If the surgeon had gotten their way, as they do 99% of the time, she would have died. So, we're about 1/3, 1/2 of the way through the book. Does anyone have any questions or anything that they want to refute so far about the Black Box Thinking book? Anything that makes you say, I didn't think of it that way, or actually, I don't know if I fully agree with this idea, for instance. All right, everyone is just enthralled with all the learning that they're having. There's something called a linear model, and it is a simple flow chart. You do research and have a theory, you apply technology, and then you have practical applications of that technology that was built. In the case of the Industrial Revolution, the conventional picture was largely inspired by the early scientific revolution. The ideas of Boyle, Hook, and Locke gave rise to machinery that have changed the world. The conventional way we think about technology is that it's top-down in character, but it's exactly the opposite. We come up with an idea, and then we create the technology to make our lives better. And that's kind of how failure works as well, too. You have an idea. So one of the examples in this book as a case study is someone was giving a presentation, but they forgot their physical media that had the presentation on it. So they weren't able to have their visual aid in order to give the presentation. And that technologist came up with the idea of, well, wouldn't it be great if you had your data anywhere you wanted, as long as you can log into the internet and get to it? And so eventually they made a cloud service that fixed an issue within their life. And that cloud service is called Dropbox. A well-studied aspect of human psychology is narrative fallacies. It refers to our ability to create stories about what we see after the event happens. Narrative fallacies arise inevitably from our continuous attempts to make sense of the world. The explanatory stories that people find compelling are simple, are concrete rather than abstract, assign a larger role to someone's talent, stupidity, and intentions rather than luck and opportunity, and focus on a few striking events that happened rather than the countless events that fail to occur. Any recent event is a candidate to become a kernel of this causal narrative. So basically, people attribute their hard work way more often to their success than they should their luck or their privilege. And they attribute laziness or unpreparedness to other people who fail rather than missed opportunity or unluckiness. It's very easy to do that. There's also a danger in perfectionism, getting things right the very first time, always. For instance, Rick is a computer science, lived in Silicon Valley. He had the idea of creating a web service that allowed people to post simple text articles online. He had this idea well before blogging revolutions happened. He sensed the potential and worked on it for 15 hours a day. Eventually, he had a working prototype, but instead of giving consumers a chance to use it, perceive its weaknesses, and make changes, he decided the software would run more efficiently if he designed a more sophisticated programming language. He spent 4 years designing this new language, and it proved disastrous. He got more and more mired in the technical details and lost sight of his original bigger picture idea. Meanwhile, other entrepreneurs began building blogging platforms that were not perfect or technologically advanced. The difference is that they were quick to put their flawed efforts out into the world for others to try. In doing so, they received crucial feedback, evolved their software, and made millions of dollars. While Rick was building his own programming language. He got too muddied in the details instead of putting himself out there. So, an example that I can give myself right now, I've been wanting to do a book club for probably 2 years now. And I've seen a few other people do it here and there. And I've convinced myself at one point that I didn't have a big enough community, or I just haven't found the right book to start off yet, or I don't really have the time or the thought process to be able to effectively do a book club. But I've gleaned information from other streamers who do it, other YouTubers, and I've taken little bits and pieces here and there, and I've made it my own thing. So some people just do a Discord discussion, other people just have a text blog that people go back and forth in comments with. For me, I'm presenting the whole book and talking about why it's important to me and giving critical primary resource from the book itself, from highlights and flags that I've made through my own reads and rereadings of it, and I'm presenting it. It might not be the best way to do a book club. This might evolve 6 months from now into something more like bringing a viewer or a fellow streamer on for an interview, and we both read this book this month and let's go back and forth and talk about it, kind of like a podcast. Or maybe I'll do something completely different. But if I don't try, if I don't put myself out there, if I don't get feedback from those of you who are either watching the VOD or the YouTube video or are in chat right now, how am I supposed to realize if this was a good use of my time if I don't present it to the world in the first place? And I think that this book and others very similar to this have definitely helped my ability to be more comfortable in myself and the decisions that I make for my stream, for my life, for my career, because I've done research. I have what is that word? I have experience, I have knowledge, and if I apply that and then learn from any sort of mistakes that I might have made, that's what really matters in the end. So for instance, the desire for perfection is something that really ate away at me until recently. It rests upon two fallacies. The first resides in the miscalculation that you can create optimal solutions sitting in an ivory tower and thinking things through rather than getting out into the real world and testing those assumptions. And then the second fallacy is a fear of failure. Perfectionism makes you spend so much time designing and strategy, my friends, strategizing about what you can do, that you don't even get a chance to fail at all until it's too late. It is a pre-closed loop behavior. You need to put yourself out there and you need to try things. You have to have the right mindset as well as the right system. If you run away from your mistakes, you won't get anywhere. It's a grueling experience. One day you're on top of the world. The next day there's a huge bug and the site is down and you're tearing your hair out. And guess what? That's still true today. Failure-based notions are finding their way into business. Agile Scrum development and the fail-fast approach are two of these. Some are more doubtlessly effective than others. All would benefit from further testing. None should be used in the wrong contexts. Drew Houston, the entrepreneur we started off with in this section, learned an important psychological lesson too. To leverage the power of failure, you have to be resilient and open, and you have to have the right mindset. Houston's company is valued at over $10 billion in 2014. It's called Dropbox. All right. So there is something called a guided missile approach. You come up with a decent model and you pull the trigger, and it is vital to react to what happens after you pull the trigger. As soon as the bullet leaves the muzzle, as soon as it comes in contact with the real world, you discover the flaws in your blueprint. You found out the wind is stronger than you anticipated, that it is raining, that there are other unknown variables interacting with the bullet and with each other, and you couldn't have possibly anticipated this in advance. And that's the problem with perfectionism. If you don't put your stuff out there, how are you supposed to know how it reacts with the current climate that you are putting it out into? So you want to integrate this new information. Success is not just dependent on before the event reasoning, but also after the trigger adaptation. The more you detect failure, the more you can finesse the path of the bullet into the right track. This reasoning illustrates the balance between top-down and bottom-up game plans and mindsets. If the original plan is hopeless, if the bullet just dribbles out of the muzzle, precision guidance is not going to help very much. But if you just rely on a ballistic plan, however sophisticated, you're going to hit the air and it's not going to hit the target. You need to get a balance between a top-down strategy and a rigorous adaptation process before you hit the target that you're looking for. As the great British economist John Maynard Keynes put it, when my information changes, I alter my conclusions. What do you do? So, Failure is clouded in ambiguity. What looks like success might be really failure, and vice versa. It is possible that sales, for instance, would have gone up even if you had not changed the course of your PR campaign, or didn't change your website, or didn't hire those developers, just because there's more of a demand for your supply, for instance. So you need to realize that success doesn't necessarily always mean success. Yay, we had more sales. If you don't find out the reasoning for it, if you don't know what changed about the climate, if you don't find out what changed that process, and you just go with the very first hypothesis of, well, it's because we updated our website and we made it very clear that what we make is right there, the very first link that you see. It's a possibility that it did affect it, but what about your competitor who just went bankrupt the quarter before, and so all of their clients came to you? It's not necessarily the website, it's other things that you need to look at as well. You can't observe the counterfactual. You don't know whether a change in sales was caused by something else or something that you haven't even considered. So, we are now in part 4, small steps and giant leaps, with marginal gains. Marginal gains are if you break down a bigger goal into small parts and then improve on each of them, you will deliver a huge increase when you put them all together. So a really common example, for instance, on Twitch is, I want to be partnered. Okay, great. What are you going to do to get there? And then a lot of people kind of just have a blank face. You need to break that down. So, for instance, Twitch has the achievements page where it says you have to have 75 concurrent viewers in order to apply for the partnership program automatically through your dashboard. So what are you going to do to do that? You need to break it down further. You need to start thinking about having a consistent schedule. But a consistent schedule of what? What game are you going to play? Or are you going to be a talk show host? Or are you going to educate people on engineering circuit boards and LED setups? And then you look further into that. Are there other YouTubers and Twitch people who are doing these things? What are they doing well? What can I do to capitalize on their successes and failures and spin it and make it my own, to be unique, to be a resource that people enjoy and get education and thoughtful and fun entertainment from? Because in the end, this is an entertainment industry. If people aren't being entertained while they're being educated, if I just did my closed captioning as the full page and I had Microsoft Sam doing the voice, and I didn't have some Skyrim atmospheres in the back, and I didn't have an interesting background for people to look at, it's most likely that people probably wouldn't find it very entertaining, and therefore it doesn't matter if I'm spitting this amazing, wax poetic information that's going to change your life. If you're not being entertained on an entertainment platform, then you're not going to take a look at it. So you have to make sure that you're looking at how you're educating and entertaining your audience as well too. So it is very easy to sit back and come up with grand theories about how to change the world. Our intuitions are wrong. The world is too complex to figure out everything from your armchair. The only way to be sure is to go out, test your ideas and programs, and realize that you will often be wrong. But that's not a bad thing. It always leads to progress. It is possible to make significant progress against the biggest problem in the world through the acclimation of a set of small steps, each well thought out, carefully tested, and implemented. If you break a performance into its component parts, you build them back up with confidence. Clear feedback is at the cornerstone of improvement. Marginal gains as an approach is about having intellectual honesty to see where you're going wrong and delivering improvements as a result of that thought process. Hello, Care Level 0. Great to have you. Enjoy your lurk. Thank you, Stay Hydrated Bot. I think I had 4 ounces of water. Let's have a little bit more. I love water so much. All right. We're getting towards the last fourth of this book. As a society, as people, we have an allergic attitude to failure. We try to avoid it, cover it up, and airbrush it from our lives. We look at cognitive dissonance, the use of euphemisms, anything to divorce us from the pain we feel when we're confronted with the realization that we underperformed. It does hurt. And it sucks. But I have found that it sucks more to continue to fail and to continue to deceive myself, because I don't deserve that. I deserve the best that I can give myself. And that means looking at painful things like failure and realizing what I can do to fix that. So, for instance, I've been streaming for like four years now. I'm not partnered, but it's not something that I've been really working very heavily or hard towards. Because if I did put a lot of effort into it, in the sense of making sure that my schedule was consistent, making sure that my content was consistent, making sure that I sacrificed times that I went to conventions or times that I hung out with family and friends, it's possible that with a lot of luck and opportunity, I could have been partnered a while ago. But I decide to balance other things instead, such as my social life, such as my actual career, rather than Twitch as a hobby. And I love it, and I enjoy my community and the Quillective and playing scary games together and talking about real talk through book clubs and things of this nature. Because it fulfills me personally to be able to do research for these things, to finish games, to share epic moments with other people rather than just myself. And through that process, I have built a lot of really wonderful relationships and friendships with people all over the world through Twitch. But there's just some sort of missing piece of the formula. There's a reason why I don't have hundreds of people in my chat. Maybe I'm not entertaining enough. Maybe I'm not silly enough. And maybe I don't put enough time into actually streaming. I only stream 1 or 2 hours a night, maybe like 2 times a week. And sometimes I'll see some trajectory of a certain game, and then you hone in on it too much, and then all of a sudden, like, well, I had like 50 people watching me, and all of a sudden I don't anymore. Why is that? Well, it's because I am not playing the game that they want me to play anymore, or they wanted to see a new person fail at the beginning levels, and now that I'm becoming competent, it's not really fun for them to watch anymore, so they move on. And so there's all these different things that you can never really know about why you're failing or why things aren't progressing the way you want them to. And so that's why it's important to retool your content, to ask feedback from people who have been around for a while, feedback from people who are newer, and ask them, hey, what do you like? What would you like to see in this channel? What are some things that you didn't really like about the community when you came in? Things of that nature. You can't really fix things if you don't know what the errors are. Hello, Jabot. Welcome. Marginal gains as a philosophy depends on the ability to detect and learn from small and latent weaknesses. The aversion to failure is the single largest obstacle to creative change. So that's something that I'm currently dealing with. I'm well known as being like a mental health, self-care, real talk sort of person. But does that come across enough in my content? Or is that something that I need to balance better? Should I do more straightforward things like this, where I talk directly about this book? Or should I be playing a game that talks about failure and then for a few minutes bring up some key points and highlights that I've made in this book, and then move on and continue to play the game. I've done a little bit of both, and both of them seem to do well, so it's basically, okay, which one is better? Which one do I like doing more? Okay, I don't know. And that's okay. Hello, really important. Thank you. Yes, it's very, very critical to ask for advice and feedback on anything, on your channel, on your content creation, on your ability to properly clean the toilet to everyone's satisfaction who uses that toilet, to when you have quarterly or annually reviews with your manager. What did you like that I did well? Should I do this better in team meetings? Should I pull back and not be as micromanaging? Do I need to put a little bit more effort in looking into what my team does and what I can do to help them? So another case study that happened here is that there were over 265 undergraduates that were randomly divided into 5-people teams, and each team was given the same task: come up with an idea how to reduce traffic congestion in San Francisco Bay Area. The first group was given the instruction to brainstorm. This is one of the most influential creative techniques in history, and based on the conception of how creativity happens, through contemplation and free flow of ideas. Brainstorming is meant to remove obstacles of logistics, minimize challenges, and people are warned not to criticize each other or point out difficulties and suggestions. Blockages are bad. Negative feedback is a sin. The second group was given no guidance at all, and they were allowed to come up with ideas in any way they thought best. And the third group was actively encouraged to point out the flaws in each other's ideas. Most research and advice suggests the best way to come up with solutions is to come up with many. Freewheeling is welcome. Don't be afraid to say anything that comes to mind. Most studies also suggest that you debate and criticize each other's ideas. The groups that had the critical, concise, and negative guidelines generated 25% more ideas than those who were just free flowing ideas and brainstorming, and they had no instructions whatsoever. When individuals were later asked to come up with more solutions, those who had the 2 other guidelines that I explained out of the 3 generated twice as many ideas as the brainstormers. So the basic finding is that encouragement of debate, even if criticism is warranted, appears to stimulate more creative ideas. And cultures that permit and encourage such expression of differing opinions and viewpoints stimulate the most innovation. But you need to do that in a very careful way. You can't shoot down someone and say, well, that idea is stupid. You want to be able to say, okay, I get where you're coming from with that idea, but this is an issue with it, so how do we get through this issue? Okay, that's your solution. But don't forget about this problem down here that lingers when this was implemented somewhere else. How would they fix it? And then keep moving and going. And all of a sudden you have all these different ideas and all of these really solid game plans. Creativity is just the connection of things, Steve Jobs has said. Innovation is highly context dependent. It is a response to a particular problem at a particular time and place. If you take away context, you remove the spur to innovate and its raw material. So that's very similar to the Dropbox and why it was created. Because one of the inventors, one of the entrepreneurs, forgot their physical flash drive media, and they said that was BS and they didn't want to deal with that anymore. And so they came up with a cloud service that if you log into anywhere that has internet, you're able to get to your presentations. Another thing that I really, really do enjoy talking about that does come up in this book is motivation versus discipline. Motivation is great. You get the idea to become a partner on Twitch, to finish this game that you've had in your library for years, to get that promotion at work. Discipline is taking that motivation and actually applying it to your routine, into your habits, and ingraining it into your life. And on days you really don't feel like it, you still go out and do it. So there are days where I don't really feel like going to the gym because I'd rather just be lazy and sleep in and all of these sort of things. But discipline, because the gym and weightlifting has become such an ingrained part of my life, I feel weird when I miss the gym I don't go to the gym for more than 2 days in a row. Because I have disciplined myself and my mindset and my schedule to integrate that into my life. And that is something that needs to happen with streaming and with getting a job promotion and with improving your relationships with your family and your friends. You have to put effort into it. And sometimes the effort that you're putting into it is misguided. And you need to look at the trajectory and reevaluate and retarget what you're looking for. Hello, Crash. Welcome. Discipline to get the manufacturing process perfect, the supply lines faultless, and delivery seamless. For instance, Dyson was not the first person to come up with the idea of a cyclone vacuum cleaner. He was not the second or the third, but he was the only one with the stamina to fail his concept into a workable solution. And he had the rigor to create an efficient manufacturing process so he can create a consistent product. His competitors confronted the same problem and had the same insight, but they did not have the same resilience to make their idea work, let alone take it onto a working production line. That is very, very important to keep in mind. Having the resilience to fail is something that takes a lot of time and effort and pain to build up. But resilience is one of the most clear examples of someone's ability to bounce back from failure and to stave off mental health issues and to be able to drive innovation and personal growth, as well as business growth too. To spark our imagination and take our insights to their fullest expression, we should not insulate ourselves from failure, but rather we should engage directly with it. And so, why is it so hard for us to be okay with failure? The anticipation of blame will cause people to cover up their mistakes. If our first reaction is to regard error as a learning opportunity, then we will be motivated to investigate what really happens. Proper investigations into failure achieves two things. It reveals a crucial learning opportunity, and professionals will feel empowered to be open and honest about their mistakes and other vital information because they know that they won't be unfairly penalized, and it drives evolution further still. Nurses in high blame teams were not speaking up about errors because they feared consequences, and so learning was being squandered. Holding people accountable and unfairly blaming others are two very different things. Blaming others may make them less accountable. They tell fewer accounts. They feel compelled to hide mistakes, and they do not participate in any improvement efforts that might be brought up later. So a problem with the difference between being held accountable and being blamed is this thought process of, if you fail, you will be blamed. If you mess up, you will be scapegoated. And people are basically told in a very subtle way, act defensively, cover your backs, and cover up precious information that we need in order to flourish. The way that you get around this is one of the most important accountability steps of all, by philosopher Virginia Sharp. Forward-looking accountability. The accountability to learn from adverse effects so future events, patients, people are not harmed by avoidable mistakes. Penalizing mistakes unfairly has a simple outcome. It destroys innovation and any enlightened risk-taking. Blame undermines information vital for meaningful adaptation. It obscures complexity of our world, deludes us into thinking we understand our environment when we should be learning from it constantly and consistently. Also, there's something called the fundamental attribution error. The sense-making part of our brain creates explanations before an investigation has been discovered. It's why studies have shown that the first instinct is almost always to blame an operator error, user error. When you see an incident, your brain seems to scream out, "What the hell was that person thinking?" It was a knee-jerk response. It takes real discipline to probe into that data without prejudging any issues. Blame is a subversion of this narrative fallacy that we talked about earlier. Another well-studied psychological tendency is called hindsight bias. It is notoriously difficult to free yourself and free your mind from a concrete eventuality. It is tough to put yourself into the shoes of an operator who acts in high-pressure circumstances and trying to reconcile different demands, unaware of how a particular decision might pan out, and they accidentally pick the wrong one. It's also Monday morning quarterback armchair thinking. So when people come back into the office Monday morning, they talk about Sunday night football and they say, "Oh, the quarterback was just absolutely horrible. I would have done this, this, and this," but they were in a high pressure situation. And then they made a decision with the best information that they could, and it wasn't the right one. And that's okay. That happens. The evolutionary process cannot function without information about what's working and what isn't. Openness is not an optional extra. It is a prerequisite for any adaptation worthy of its name. We all have an inbuilt bias towards simplicity over complexity. True ignorance is not the absence of knowledge, but the refusal to acquire it. All right, we're in the last chapters. Precious information gets concealed out of sheer terror of consequences. Forward-looking accountability collapses because of blame culture. There's something called the second victim. Studies show that professionals suffer feelings of distress, agony, fear, anguish, guilt, and depression, and have a prevalence of suicidal thoughts when they are blamed for systematic errors. So, there's something called the Beckham effect. It is striking how often successful people have a counterintuitive perspective on failure. They are intimately aware of how indispensable failure is to the overall process, and they embrace rather than shy away from this part of the journey. Michael Jordan, the basketball star, said, "I've missed over 9,000 shots. I've lost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusting to take the game-winning shot and I missed." Mental toughness and heart are a lot stronger than some of the physical advantages I might have. I've always said that, and I always believe that. James Dyson of the vacuum fame was once called an evangelist for failure. The most important quality I look for when people come to work for Dyson is the willingness to try, fail, and learn. I love that spirit, and it's all too rare in the world today. If learning from failure is vital to success, how do we both overcome the internal as well as the external barriers that prevent this from happening? So, there is something called fixed and growth mindsets. A fixed mindset is the belief that your basic qualities like your intelligence and talent are fixed traits. You have a certain amount of it and you can't do much to change it. That's a very negative way of looking at life. And everyone should shift to something called a growth mindset. It is the belief that your most basic abilities can be developed through hard work, discipline, resiliency, and luck. They do not believe that innate intelligence is irrelevant, but they can become smarter through persistence and dedication. As a group, they disagree with statements such as, "Your intelligence is something about you can't change very much." Of course, there are some times where we might be a little bit more fixed or growth set, but People in a fixed mindset ignore mistakes. They had a helmet cap on their heads, and they measured electrical activity in the brain. So, the brain always sits up and pays attention to when things go wrong, when a pattern gets scrambled. No one likes to mess up, especially when it's something as simple as identifying what letter has been flashed in front of you, which is what the experiment was. So there's something called a PE signal. Those who had a growth mindset ideology recorded a signal that was vastly higher than those in a fixed mindset. It was 3 times larger. It was if the brain of those who have fixed mindsets ignored the mistakes and was not paying attention to them other than the initial blip of, oh, that's a mistake. Those who had a growth mindset saw the mistake of great interest and had a lot of attention directed towards it. Those who had a larger size of a PE signal in these study was directly correlated with improvement of performance in the aftermath of those mistakes as the survey went on. Growth mindset thinks about errors in a different way than those in a fixed mindset. They believe progress is driven in a large part by practice, and they naturally regard failure as an inevitable process of learning. Kids who were in a growth mindset in another study didn't even consider themselves as failing. They taught themselves new things and more sophisticated strategies for addressing the new, more difficult problems that popped up. A few of them even solved problems that were supposedly beyond their years to be able to solve. For children and people who are in a fixed mindset, if you have a static attitude towards intelligence, failure is debilitating. It shows that you're not up to the job, and you might as well give up because you cannot change how much talent or intelligence you have, which is absolutely not true. For people in the growth mindset, everything changes. Intelligence is dynamic, something that can grow and expand and improve. Difficulties are not regarded as reasons to give up, but as learning opportunities. Children in this group spontaneously said things like, "I love challenges," and "mistakes are friends." It is basic contours of human psychology. When a company changes their culture to a growth mindset, people agree with statements such as, "This company genuinely supports risk-taking and will support me even if I fail." When people make mistakes, this company sees the learning as value added, or people are encouraged to be innovative. Creativity is welcome. Hello, Silver Nightwing. You used to have a growth mindset and transition to a fixed one. Oh no, go back. Go back. There are some times where you do need to realize that, well, I haven't studied a lot of history. So me going to a pub trivia game that is based on history, I'm probably not going to do very well. But that doesn't mean that I can't improve and do better and watch hundreds of YouTube videos of people who are historians and read really interesting books by people like Howard Zinn and build up my knowledge of history. So when I go back to that pub trivia game 6 months from now, I'm going to win it. That's growth mindset. That kind of idea. Realizing that you might be in a fixed state currently, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be there permanently. Does that make sense? When someone is given a new challenge, such as giving a major presentation to a new client, it is inevitable that they will be less than perfect. It takes time to build your expertise, even for exceptionally hardworking and intelligent people. There are huge differences in how individuals respond. Some people love challenge. They look for feedback, they talk to colleagues, they seek out chances to be involved in future presentations, and they always improve. But others are threatened by initial failure, and they engage in astonishingly sophisticated avoidance strategies to ensure that they are never put in a situation to present ever again. They sabotage their own progress of becoming a more well-rounded and thoughtful human being because of their fear of messing up. Don't let failure hold you back. Who cares? We all fail. And as long as you can say, you know what? This is how much effort I was able to put in. This is how much I know about this subject. I applied myself. I tried. I failed. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to learn what I need to learn. So for instance, you might love history and you love seeing the connections of all these different societies, but the pub trivia game you were doing was, well, what date exactly did this person get assassinated? And it's like, well, it was like December something in like 1946. And it's like, well, excuse me, you were actually supposed to say 8:30 a.m. on December 12th, and therefore you get no points. Well, it's like, okay, well, that changes the rules. I need to be more precise in this thought process. But another pub across town might have a trivia night about history, and they ask something to the effect of who was also assassinated in a very similar way. And if you're not thinking about history in that kind of lens, in that perspective, you might be like, I have no idea, I can't really think of one. But if you're like, well, yeah, someone who gets assassinated by poisoning of their meal, that happened to this person, this person, this person. There's, that phrase where if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, then you're going to think it's stupid for the rest of your life. And that's not true. They just have different intelligence, different knowledge, different perspectives, and different situations in life that make them incredibly suited to the environment that they're in right now. And if you put them in something totally different, they're going to look like they're floundering and failing. But it's because they haven't grown in that ideology or in that thought process or in that situation. And it's unfair to judge people based off of that. Oh, one of the coolest thing that I ever saw in this book was towards the end. Angela D. Duckworth was an American psychologist in 2004, and she was approached by military chiefs to ask if she could measure the grit, the resilience of aspiring candidates at West Point. There was this huge thing called a whole candidate score. It was hundreds of questions, bunch of puzzles and challenges. So her questionnaire was a 5-minute survey asking respondents to rate themselves from 1 to 5 according to 12 basic statements such as, setbacks don't discourage me, and I finish whatever I begin. She wanted to find out if aspects of someone's character, their willingness to persevere through failure, would prove a stronger predictor than the sophisticated whole candidate score. And the results were clear. When test scores came back, the grit rating was a significantly superior predictor of success than the whole candidate score exam. Duckworth carried on giving out the grit questionnaire for the next 5 years. Every single year, it was a more and more powerful predictor. Your resiliency, your grit, your ability to bounce back, your ability to see failures as a learning opportunity is one of the most important things that you can do to make your life better. If you're constantly looking things in a negative light, if you are constantly saying, woe is me, if you are constantly putting yourself down for not being perfect, you are cutting yourself down at your foundation and not letting yourself grow and flourish and learn. And we need to redefine failure. James Dyson, who we talked about earlier, worked his way through 5,127 prototypes, while his competitors didn't even get through the first 100. Not because he was more intelligent, because he was more resilient. David Beckham and Michael Jordan may have been born with admirable sporting qualities and physical traits, but this would have meant little without their growth mindsets. And that's the point. A growth-oriented culture is not happy, clappy, wishy-washy, we're all winners. It is a cutting-edge approach to organizational psychology based on the most scientific principle of all. We all progress fastest when we face up to our failures and learn from it. When we see failure in a new light, success becomes new and exhilarating. Competence is no longer static or a phenomenon. It is something reserved. It is seen as a dynamic growth opportunity that we can strive for and push for. We shouldn't be motivated to boast about what we currently know, and we shouldn't get defensive when people point gaps in our knowledge. We should take those as learning opportunities. You are not born with a fear of failure. It is not an instinct. It is something that grows and develops in you as you get older. Very young children have no fear of failure at all. They have great fun in trying new things and learning very fast. Our focus here is to fail well and being good at failure, taking risk and then learning from it if it doesn't work. There's no point in failing and then dealing with it by pretending it didn't happen or blaming someone else. That's a wasted opportunity to learn more about yourself and identify gaps in your skills, experiences, or qualifications. Once you identified learning, then you could take action to make a difference and become a better person. So that is Black Box Thinking. I love this book. I love talking about failure. I love the growth mindset. I really enjoy all this psychological definitions and examples that were brought up here. There's a lot of really great case studies in here as well too. And I like this because it's a very intelligent book in the sense that it's not just telling you be better because it's better for yourself. They give case studies. They give scientific and economic and psychological and business-oriented definitions and thought processes throughout this whole book. And it doesn't just make you feel good. Like, this has helped change the way that I look at life in an immense way. Because I've always kind of known this stuff because I studied psychology and I still keep up with things that go on within that sphere of the world. But having it in a nice book in this way, and like, you know, you get like some case studies and you get learn some things, and then you have another case study, you just like kind of go through, and all of a sudden, like, look at this, like I have all of these different markers in here and highlights. I've read this book 3 times now, and I'd probably read it again a year from now, because it's good for you to get a refresher on what you've learned and make sure that you're honing yourself and targeting things properly. So the book, this is our Saturday morning book club, Black Box Thinking. There is an Amazon link there. I am an affiliate with Amazon. I really do highly recommend this book. Thank you so much for coming out to our Saturday morning book club.